Most of the actions on D+1 were aimed at the destruction of scattered German groups, which still held positions within the perimeter of the Utah beachhead. The airborne operations had pocketed sizable enemy forces which had to be eliminated before communications and supply lines could be secured. The Lafayette Bridge and St. Mere-Eglise remained the critical areas in the western sector, with the 82nd Airborne Division still being out of touch with higher headquarters. Between the 82nd Airborne Division's main body at St. Mere-Eglise and the 8th Infantry Regiment at Les Forges, the enemy still had a large force holding the ridge between Fauville and Turqueville. Another enemy force was threatening the 82nd Airborne from the north. The elimination of these resistance pockets became the main objective of both the 8th Regiment and the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment on June 7th. The 8th Regiment attacked the Turqueville salient on the morning of June 7th with the objective of establishing contact with the 82nd Airborne at St. Mere-Eglise. The 1st Battalion's attack on Turqueville itself was the first to get underway late in the morning and succeeded in eliminating the eastern tip of the enemy salient. Meanwhile, the 2nd and 3rd Battalions attacked northward to link up with the 82nd. As the two battalions reached a creek bed in front of the enemy lines, they received heavy machine gun and artillery fire from enemy positions along the ridge. The 3rd Battalion on the left was held up and had one of the severest fights of the first few days, but the 2nd Battalion broke through and continued its advance toward St. Mere-Eglise. South of the town, enemy interdiction of the road caused the 2nd Battalion to circle around and make an approach to the town from the northeast. But almost immediately after it had established contact with the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, it was engaged by the enemy north of the town. Colonel McNeely and Colonel Vandervoort planned a coordinated attack. The 2nd Battalion of the 505th moved up astride the road with tank support, while the 2nd Battalion of the 8th Infantry Regiment crossed the road between the 505th and attacked on its left. By the end of the day, the two battalions had killed or captured 300 Germans and cleared the enemy from his positions to the west of the highway. Earlier in the afternoon, an enemy armored thrust from the north had been beaten back on the very edge of St. Mere-Eglise by the 746th Tank Battalion. This force had been dispatched by the order of the Corps commander himself, who learned of the 82nd Division's request for assistance upon his arrival at the Corps command post late in the morning. On reaching St. Mere-Eglise, the tank column turned north. After moving a few hundred yards, it received fire from an enemy armored column consisting of 5 tanks and a few other vehicles. At a cost of 2 of their own, the American tank force destroyed 2 enemy tanks, took 60 prisoners, and freed 19 American paratroopers. The remaining German vehicles retreated and stayed in Neuville-aux-Plaines until they withdrew for lack of infantry support. It's not clear whether the German armor had come from Neuville-aux-Plaines and was supposed to assist the infantry along the highway, but the two actions do not appear to have been coordinated. Whatever the enemy's intentions, the American tank and infantry attack along the highway removed the enemy threat to the town and allowed the 82nd Airborne to give more attention to developments along the Méditerranée River. Before the German threat north and south of St. Mere-Eglise had been eliminated, the 325th Glider Infantry Regiment had arrived and was ready for commitment against the enemy to the west. The Glider Infantry had arrived in 2 waves, one at 0700 and one at 0900. Although the landings were somewhat scattered, most of them were made in the Les Forges area. One wave received ground fire from enemy positions to the north, and there were a total of 160 landing casualties. But the regiment was given some protection by the attacks of the 8th Infantry Regiment and made it a rapid assembly near the Les Forges crossroad. The Glider Infantry had the mission of proceeding to Chef du Pont, but when Colonel Harry Lewis, the regiment's commander, contacted the division headquarters by radio, he was instructed to at least use part of his force to eliminate another resistance pocket to the west, where the Germans were threatening the security of Chef du Pont Bridge and Causeway. Colonel Lewis personally took his 3rd Battalion to the Carquebou area and sent the other 2 to Chef du Pont. He found Carquebou evacuated by the enemy and proceeded to rejoin the other 2 battalions. Eventually, the 2nd Battalion was attached to the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, and the 1st Battalion was sent to Lafayette, where the battle for the bridge had been a continued stalemate. Enemy counterattacks were repulsed, and the American position was slightly strengthened by reorganization, but no progress had been made in establishing a bridgehead on the western bank. In general, the situation of the 82nd Airborne at the end of D+1 had been solidified only around St. Mere-Eglise. On the same day, the 4th Division extended the northern arc of the beachhead some 2 miles in its advance towards Cherbourg and pushed the enemy back against the fortresses at Azeville and Kriesbeck. On the beach, the 3rd Battalion, 22nd Regiment continued the methodical destruction of beach defenses, while the 12th Regiment attacked northwestward. The 2nd Battalion fought a sharp engagement on the eastern outskirts of Neuville-au-Plan, but didn't take possession of the town, thus necessitating its capture by other units later in the day. Early in the afternoon, the 12th Regiment was stopped on the forward slope of Azeville, where its battalions reorganized for the night. The gap between the 12th and 8th Regiments was covered by Company A of the 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion. Probably the most difficult of the 4th Division's missions were those assigned to the 22nd Regiment on the division's right flank. The regiment had the task of destroying both the strong points along the beach and the heavily fortified batteries at Azeville and Kriesbeck. The 1st and 2nd Battalions started out at 0700 from their positions at Saint-Germain and approached the higher ground until they received fire from the 2 forts. The 2nd Battalion tried for several hours to move forward against the Azeville position, but a counterattack drove it back to its line of departure with considerable losses. The 1st Battalion attack on Kriesbeck was even more fiercely contested. The narrow trail passing through Saint-Marcouf was the only approach the battalion could make. To the east, the ground dropped off to the town of Kriesbeck and the swampland, and to the west, the ground was high and open. As the 3 companies moved forward, they received artillery fire from the Azeville battery. They inched ahead up the trail, but once they came close to the fortifications, the Germans counterattacked their left flank. Although the battalion tried to contain the counterattack, Captain Tom Shields of Company A, who took command of the battalion when its commanding officer was wounded, decided that the position was too dangerous to hold and ordered a withdrawal. The battalion became increasingly disorganized as it retreated, still under heavy fire. 19 men of Company A were cut off and probably captured. Another platoon on the right lost its way and wandered as far as the beach, which was still in enemy hands. Late that night, these men found their way back to the battalion, bringing with them 113 prisoners. On the southern arc of the beachhead, the leading elements of the 101st Airborne Division converged on Saint-Côme-du-Mont in preparation for an attack on the bridges which span the Douve and its tributaries northwest of Carentan. Captain Schettle's men of the 506th Regiment and Colonel Johnson's miscellaneous forces continued to hold their positions at the La Barquette Lock and the Le Port bridges. After dark on D-Day, Captain Schettle's engineers had prepared the 2 bridges for demolition, but on the morning of D-Day+1, the Germans made no attempt to cross the river. Later in the afternoon, about 300 Germans were seen approaching Captain Schettle's position from the north. One of the patrols he sent out against them demonstrated so successfully that, overimpressed with American strength, some of the Germans began to surrender. The enemy force which Captain Shettle dealt with turned out to be elements of the 6th Parachute Regiment. The bulk of this force attacked Colonel Johnson's group of some 250 men at the La Barquette Lock that same afternoon. Colonel Johnson had improved his position the night of D-Day, but he was short of ammunition and still isolated. At about 1500 hours, Colonel Johnson saw German troops approaching his position from the northeast. At first, he was not sure whether they were friendly or hostile. They came straight through the fields and marshes, heading directly for the river. Colonel Johnson's position faced south, and he had to redispose his men and machine guns to meet this threat from the north. When Colonel Johnson's men opened fire, the Germans took cover and called in artillery and mortar fire. It was difficult to spot the Germans in the clumps of tall grass, and after the firefight had gone on for a while, Colonel Johnson became worried about the expenditure of ammunition. At this critical moment, several cries of surrender from across the fields indicated that Johnson might possibly get the whole enemy force to surrender. He gave the ceasefire order and went forward with 2 volunteers. As the 3 men walked forward, the firing suddenly broke out again, wounding the colonel and one of his men. They crawled back to their own lines and the fight continued. In about a half an hour, the German fire slackened and Colonel Johnson decided to try again. This time, he and 2 enlisted men were met halfway by 2 wounded German privates who said they wanted to surrender but that their officers were shooting men who talked about it. Colonel Johnson sent one of them back to the German lines with the message that they were to surrender in 30 minutes or be annihilated by superior forces. The Germans called his bluff and resumed firing, but exactly 30 minutes later, the first small group of Germans formed a column and came into the American lines. It was the beginning of a procession of 350 Germans which continued until after dark. About 150 Germans had been killed or wounded. The rest escaped to Carentan. Colonel Johnson's force had lost 10 killed and 30 wounded. The appearance of enemy paratroopers in this area was not entirely expected. Captured prisoners revealed that one battalion had been in the Verville area for some weeks, engaged in anti-airborne defense preparations and exercises. On June 7th, this battalion found itself surrounded by American airborne forces and was moving south with no apparent plan, direction, or resolution when it encountered Colonel Johnson's and Captain Shettle's forces. That same battalion of paratroopers was spotted from Verville by General Taylor and Colonel Sink when the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment began to move southward. At Verville, the regiment split into two columns. Both battalions were pinned down by machine gun and small arms fire soon after they came out of Verville, and moved on again only after the arrival of armor support. When the two battalions reached the crossroads east of Saint-Côme-du-Mont, the 501st Regiment pressed the attack south with its 2nd Battalion, commanded by Colonel Ballard, and the support of 6 medium tanks. The tanks attacked boldly, spraying the hedgerows with machine gun fire and using 75mm guns against buildings and other suspected strongpoints. When the battalion reached the road junction, Colonel Ballard was ordered by Colonel Sink to hold there for the night. The two commanders then made plans for a new attack on June 8th. By the night of June 7th, a considerable force of the 101st Airborne had gathered in the area for the next day's attack. It was clear that the initial assault on the East Cotentin had succeeded. At the same time, however, it was obvious that the operation had not gone entirely according to plan. Elements of the 82nd Airborne still remained isolated west of the Mere-Eglise. East of the river, the Germans still held strong positions in both the north and the south. To be sure, the enemy was too weak at the moment to make more than a piecemeal counterattack, and this confusion was epitomized by the Parachute Battalion, which had wandered through American positions and surrendered to the small force of Colonel Johnson and Captain Shettle. But the danger of a major counterattack had not passed. It was conceivable that the German reinforcements might push up from Carentan and overwhelm the weak American forces clinging to the rim of the Duvet marshes. The continued failure of the 82nd Airborne to establish a bridgehead over the Mere-Eglise and the 4th Division's slow progress on the northern flank forced the modification in the VII Corps plan. It was originally planned that part of the 4th Division would cross the Mere-Eglise, capture Valognes, and continue northwards to Cherbourg. The 90th Division, part of which started landing on D-Day, was to drive toward Cherbourg on the right. But both the 82nd and the 4th had made only slow progress during the first 2 days. The 4th Division was ordered to continue its attack in the north, with elements of the 82nd taking over the left flank of this northward drive. The remainder of the 82nd was to continue on its D-Day mission of establishing a bridgehead over the Mere-Eglise. The 90th Division was given another mission a few days later. In the southern sector, the 101st Airborne was to continue its mission of securing the southern flank of the beachhead by seizing causeway approaches to Carentan.